Hey friends. The idea of today's video is to give you some context for the important ideas about democracy that come out of England. And I don't know what you think about when you think about England, but maybe you think about some of these kind of tourist stereotypes. They're real. These things that are in England that you hear about people enjoying as tourists, like the telephone boxes and the Big Ben, the double-decker buses. These are features of life in London. Maybe you think about castles, and maybe you think about the fact that England is a rocky island in the sea, in the Atlantic. Maybe you think about the English obsession with tea and the formal tea ceremony that is afternoon tea, pictured here with the scones and little tea sandwiches. Um, all these things are cool things about England. There's also, obviously deeper and less touristy stories to tell. And hopefully you'll talk about that in class. And as we go through this class, we'll learn a lot more about England. I wanted to clear up some stuff about the names. So there are so many different names people use here. So England, as a term that we probably should use less, it refers to the English people, kind of an ethnic group that started out in this part of the island, and took over very different ethnic groups that have different languages and traditions, called the Welsh, the Scottish, the Irish. And when referring to the Irish, eventually were able to get some of their independence back, and so that's what's marked here by this border, the part of Ireland that's still part of the United Kingdom and the part that's not. So the word England really just refers to this part of the island and to the English people. Be really careful about that, especially when it comes to soccer. English soccer is not the same as Welsh soccer or Scottish soccer. But then the nation refers to itself as the United Kingdom, and that's kind of like a PC way of saying the English, the Welsh, the Scottish, the Irish united together. Of course, it's not always such a happy unity, but the name at least tries to allude to something pleasant. And Great Britain really refers to the big island here, this whole big island. So the people use these words interchangeably, but probably the United Kingdom is the best word to use when we're talking about the nation. So just a little freebie. You might have thought of the London Bridge as something you remember about England. And oftentimes people in their mind are seeing this bridge when they think of London Bridge and the song, London Bridge is falling down. Because this bridge does in fact go up and down. I'm not sure, because it's in all the marketing videos about London. But this is actually not London Bridge. This is Tower Bridge. I'll tell you about the tower in a minute. London Bridge did fall down. It was in long ago times a big bridge that had a lot of buildings on it, and that's not really a good idea for a bridge. And it did begin to become quite hazardous and had to be replaced. This is the boring but beautiful London Bridge today in London. Something else that we can go into more as the year progresses is just the incredible diversity that is England, the United Kingdom today. And this is partly because the United Kingdom took over so many countries around the world, and that led to mixing of people, and lots of folks who live in the UK today their ancestors come from one of those colonies. So this picture reminds me that the best Indian food that I've ever had, I actually had in London, and that's courtesy of this, huge, diverse, multiracial community that the United Kingdom is today. So we'll go into that more, but those are just a few little thoughts about the United Kingdom. Our story today actually starts with King John, and so King John is was a king in the line of William the Conqueror, who came over to England from France, actually, and built this amazing castle, which is called the Tower and is near the Tower Bridge. And you can go see it as a tourist if we ever get to do those kinds of things again. It's one of those kind of classic castles, with the crenellated tops and the arrow slits, and it has a descending gate with the points on it, and all kinds of cool stuff. This is the aerial view, and that is the tower that was originally built by William the Conqueror when he took over England. So King John was part of William the Conqueror's line, and in the time that we're talking about is the feudal system in England. So we've talked about the feudal system a little bit before, this idea that the king is all powerful, owns everything, all the land, all the people. They need, however, a nobility to help them govern, and so those folks get given some extra privileges in exchange for helping the king to manage the kingdom, whereas the majority of the population is what's called serfs or peasants, folks who have no rights and are basically the property of the king associated with the land, and a very small number of what they call freemen, meaning folks who have somehow managed to escape that system and operate a little bit on the outside as, for example, business people. So we've talked about this before. King John was at the top of such a system in England, and as such, he had a large group of nobles, and nobles would be entitled to some privileges, including their own little castle. This is an example of what a noble might have gotten. The land that surrounds that castle would still technically belong to the king, but would be managed by the noble, and the serfs who live and work on that land would be not exactly the property of the noble, but they're the property of the king, but they're under the noble's command. So King John had this system going, and the only problem was that King John loved to go to war. So part of what was going on for the nobles is that they never got to enjoy their little castles and their land because King John was constantly getting into wars, and they would be ordered to round up a bunch of their serfs and go off into battle on behalf of King John. And just as soon as one battle had finished and they got home to their little castle, another would start. So the nobility under King John became quite frustrated. And what would you do if you had a king like that who was all powerful but was completely out of control and was making the system completely untenable? Well, the nobles got together and they conspired to create a document that would define limits and appropriate borders and barriers for John. And they convinced him to sign it under penalty of something worse. So here we have King John looking all contemplative, and this is the document that he's signing and his nobles surrounding it. And the year is 1215 AD, or Common Era. You can imagine King John was not thrilled about giving up this kind of power. They actually made multiple copies of this document and made him sign all of them in order to prevent him from later on saying that he didn't sign it or it didn't exist, or tearing up some copies and trying to get rid of it. But the idea of this document was to limit the power of the king. So what it did is it changed an absolute monarchy, one that has total power for the king, into a limited or constitutional monarchy, where the power is shared between the king and the nobles, and where there are written rules that the king is subject to. So this is changing up the whole dynamic, because now the king is underneath the law, where before the king was the law. Here's a picture of one of the copies of the Magna Carta. So, hand printed and each one individually signed. There are some of these that remain and some that King John and other kings tried to destroy. The word Magna Carta just means big paper, Magna Carta. And so it's just a big document that lays out a whole set of rules. And we'll study this a little bit more in class. But the idea was to share power between the king and the nobles. This sounds a little bit democratic, and it is, but it's not hugely democratic because it's still just the king and the nobles. In order, however, for the king to have regular meetings and conversations with this group of nobles and for the nobles to meet with each other, eventually a building had to be created for all these conversations. And this is the building with the famous Big Ben. It's called the Parliament Building. The French word for speaking, for conversation, is parler. This is the place where people parler, the parliament. There you have it. But at the point that the Magna Carta was written, the parley is really just between the king and the nobles. A little bit later, another English king, a successor to King John, decided, I love this parliament idea. I like the idea of talking to people, and I find that when I do all these kind of conversations in order to make decisions, that people are more invested in them and I get better results. So as King Edward's preparing to go to war, he wanted to expand Parliament and included more people in the discussion. And he created a part of Parliament that's referred to as the Commons. The idea was to get more people involved, not just nobles, but, quote, common people. So check out this tapestry that was made around that time to illustrate the expansion of the Parliament. Who's in this new expanded Parliament? Over here, we've got these fancy dress guys. Can you work in those shoes in the fields? I don't think so, right? These are not laborers. These are not serfs. These are other wealthy people who just don't happen to be nobles. Over here, what do you think these guys do for a living? You've got these items here on the table. Many people interpret this as a picture of merchants or business people in the community that were allowed to be included in the commons. And then over here, you have representatives of the church, so priests and other functionaries within the church hierarchy. So the new parliament created under Edward I had a lot more people involved in this discussion with the king and was definitely more democratic, but it definitely doesn't include any serfs. It's about including the upper classes of society a little bit more in the decisions. And it is definitely making things somewhat more democratic. Other kings had a much worse relationship with Parliament, and in fact, there's a whole bunch of fighting that continues to happen. I wanted to flag one of those fights. Henry VIII, another successor in this long line of kings, had a thing going on, and it relates a little bit to the feudal system, so I just want to go back and show you this picture. You might notice that it's kind of unclear what the relationship is between the church and the king. The king is supposed to represent God, but then again, so is the church. So who the boss? It's a little bit unclear. Generally, the church was willing to take a back seat as long as the king was doing all the things that they thought were necessary. Henry VIII got into a fight with the church. The fight was he wanted to have a new wife, and then another, because he was trying to have an heir, someone born to his wife that would be able to take over for him. And that wasn't going so well. So he wanted to get rid of one wife and get a new one. The church and he were not getting along. So the church said, you know what? We're not going to allow you out of your marriage. You have to stay married to this person. And that's that. The Catholic rules basically disallow divorce, and he was not being allowed any way around those rules. So Henry VIII said, you know what? I'm more powerful than the church. I speak for God. I'm creating my own church. And this is the origin of the Anglican, or sometimes called Episcopal Protestant church. So this is breaking up the whole relationship between the Catholic Church and the king, and that was very controversial. Once that break happens, you might ask yourself, wait a minute, is this king a representative of God? For a lot of common folk, this is one of the moments where they're saying, I'm not sure I really believe in that stuff anymore, and if that's true, then maybe I don't even believe in kings. So a dangerous, for the king, situation is emerging in England. That culminated in the trial and execution of a king later on. And this is a painting memorializing that event. So Charles I tried to shut down Parliament, didn't want to deal with Parliament, didn't want to talk to those people, wanted to have absolute power, and tried to ignore Parliament. And Parliament fought back against him, put him on trial, and had him executed. And here is the leader of Parliament at that time, Oliver Cromwell, looking down on the body of the king, which has been reassembled after the head was put back in the coffin with the body. Think about this. If you believe that your king is a representative of God, do you stand over him like this? Wouldn't you be on your knees? This picture is designed by the artist to represent the end of the concept of divine right. That Parliament could do this to King Charles I represents that Parliament doesn't care about kings anymore, and about the whole idea of kings and God. So it didn't go so well for Cromwell and the Parliament. After some time of working together, Cromwell decided he should be the ultimate dictator of everything, and he didn't want to listen to Parliament either. That led to another uprising. Cromwell eventually died. People were so angry at him by the time it all came down that even though he died, he was not executed. They took his dead body and executed it just so that they could enjoy the revenge against Cromwell. So that first venture into kingless democracy did not go so well. There were many other events, some quite bloody, and that led up of arguments between Parliament and the king about who was the boss, and other kings who tried to shut down Parliament and ignore it. And the result of this was that in 1689, Parliament finally made a deal with a king, elevating William and Mary out of the whole royal family and saying, okay, these are our people. These are the ones who will agree to let Parliament do what Parliament needs to do. And before allowing William and Mary to become the king, Parliament wrote down a set of guidelines for what kings could and could not do, taking the Magna Carta and advancing it for them into the modern era with more specific restrictions on the king's power. This is called the English Bill of Rights. And having signed the English Bill of Rights, William and Mary were allowed to become king and queen of England. And that is what brings us to the status quo in England, where we have a queen who's a member of that family, a part of that royal line, but whose job is purely ceremonial, who can follow the events of the day, but is not allowed to influence them, who is the servant of Parliament as opposed to Parliament being their partner or their servant. And so Queen Elizabeth, this is her one of her crests. The R stands for Rex, or the king. We talked about this a little bit in class, and we can talk more about how things are working right now if you desire. So what we will focus on, though, is the two documents that come out of this, the Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights, which set a precedent and that are repeated and drawn upon around the world when people create law. And the big precedent here is just the idea that no ruler is above the law. A very interesting idea and very influential. So we'll talk about the documents in class. Thank you for listening.